Right, how are you doing? Very good morning to you. Welcome back. Today is quite an interesting day, isn't it? Because we normally set aside for health and nutrition and, just going by even the theme that Safin and Ayub have been talking about. We're right on the money. Let's move it now to nutrition and food, and this is something that you should be talking about, thinking about as well. One of the biggest conversations, even in the build-up to the elections and even after, has been all about food security. You see all the situations that are going on, drought, etc. Government now saying that they're trying to move to, introduce genetically modified foods, some of them drought-resistant strains, they say, to help some of the cases. Questions that people are asking is it safe? What is this food security? Are we secure? What needs to be done? Well, to help us with that conversation today, I'll allow her to introduce herself so that then I can get the flow of her last name. She has told me how to pronounce it, but it's a beautiful name. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Nice to meet you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Right.
My name is Sheila Ochugboju.
Ochugboju.
Yes.
All right.
I'm Nigerian. I grew up in the UK, hence the slight accent. But yeah, I'm the executive director of the Alliance for Science. And we do a lot of work around science communication across the world.
Right. Big
team here in Kenya. And at the moment, really supporting the national conversation around GMOs.
All right. So, of course, that's what we're also asking you as well. What questions do you have around GMO foods as well, the conversation around it as well? What questions do you have? The SMS line is 2242. If you have any questions, you can ask, and they will be answered. And then also, if you have any comments about it, because I'm sure you do, you have probably some fears. It's good because, like you said, there's a conversation that must be had. And, as the fourth estate, once we have these conversations out there, and, people who do media monitoring or the leaders themselves, if they're watching, will be able to pass across this information. So remember, the SMS line is 2242. The hashtag to use is Daybreak. That is on Twitter. But if you're SMSing, you can leave your name, where you're watching. Or if you want to be discreet, it's okay. You can just go ahead and text. We'll still read it, all right? So let's start there. I talked about food security in the beginning, and that's a big topic. And everybody's asking, every time it comes up, we always say that drought is not breaking news because we know it's going to be there next year. Hence, there needs to be government preparedness. But what is the current status of food security?
Well, globally, the world is still very food insecure. Okay. We thought we were doing better in terms of global food production is high. But with the COVID pandemic, with the war on Ukraine, with ongoing conflicts, it has risen. About 838 million more people are going hungry. Right. So globally around the world, you have about 2.3 billion people who are food insecure. Here in Kenya, you have about 4.4 million. And there are regions where there are pockets of famine. Every year this is recurring. Right. And every year we ask ourselves the same questions. And this year that Kenya celebrates Kenya at 60, there's a moment of reflection saying 60 years post-independence, why are we still talking about famine every year in a country that is as innovative and as productive as Kenya? Right.
So, if you paint a picture like that, I guess it puts the seriousness of the issue because then if we've been here for 60 years and like you said, we're innovative and moving forward and every year we have food trucks and everything. And this year we even had the government saying, help us chip in with some money. So what do you think, where do you think we've gone wrong as a nation? What do you think is the problem?
It's not just the nation, it's a global problem with the food systems. Right. So we have a food systems failure or inefficiencies in different countries. So the food system has failed us in different ways. Here in Africa, we have had an over-reliance on many inputs, which were from abroad, fertilizers, some of our stocks were from abroad. And then when you have something like the Ukraine food crisis, you find that the whole system breaks down because of a critical input like fertilizer, reduces productivity and yields. But then again, we have climate change. There's some things that we can't do much about. Well, we can do a lot about, but then they're things we have to mitigate in different ways, and that's climate change. So every year the rains are failing. It took the world some time to know that these seasonal changes are not just seasonal changes, they're long-term problematic shocks that we have to now prepare for.
Right.
So when I first came in 2009, people would say, oh, it's unusual weather, it's not normally like this. And then every year they'd say, it's unusual, something like that. And after about 10, I said, listen, if you're saying this every year, this is now normal. Right. This unusual weather is now normal.
Right.
So how are we preparing for the new norm? And Kenyans, not everybody around the world, we're looking at how to prepare for climate change, when to plant, how to plant, and what kinds of improved varieties, not just GMOs, but also hybrids that are drought-tolerant, pest-resistant, because these shocks will continue. Let's be real.
Right. So even as they do, like you talked about, there are pockets of famine, like you said, in the country.
Yes.
So we have a government that is seeking solutions. Most of these places are people who are also coupled with drought and famine. They're battling poverty as well. So how does the government make that person who is suffering, who is facing all those myriad of problems, how do they make it easier for them in terms of food security?
I mean, you start from a simple principle or premise that a country should be able to feed itself with the basic staple foods that are important to the people. So here it's maize.
Right.
So if you start with a simple premise that you should have sufficient maize because this is the national dish, then you have to look at a crop how are the maize stocks every year, and what kinds of varieties, how can you improve it, and what is the major challenge to maize? Drought is a big one. And then how can you support farmers who are mostly smallholder farmers? So they have a limited capacity to buy inputs like pesticides, fertilizer. They have limited access to credit. So how can you help these ecosystems of smallholder farmers who are the ones actually feeding the nation?
Right.
And you can do it. I mean, I was very happy to go to Kirinyaga 2 weeks ago. We went to Mwaye and we looked at a demonstration plot that of actually hybrid rice and BT cotton, where the new improved varieties farmers were invited to try them and to grow them, and then invite other farmers at point of harvest to tell them what happened. And so what was great about this, so we were with the Africa Agricultural Technology Foundation, who does a lot of work here in Kenya, looking at hybrid and genetically modified seeds. Right. So where we were looking at hybrid rice. And this rice was amazing because this rice was bred by plant breeders in Kisumu, and then crossbred in Malindi to strengthen it. And then now here we are in Kirinyaga, so it's like truly Kenyan rice. Right. And farmers there had a part in developing the varieties. So they gave the scientists input on, we want longer grain. The millers gave the varieties. So now the farmers were invited to look at this harvest and to see if it's what they want. Right. So I'm bringing this in because what was interesting about that, it's not just about the seeds. You also have to say, what else do they need? You also need a level of pesticide or pest control, and which ones are environmentally friendly and cost-effective. Fertilizers, so how do farmers get those? And then access to credit. And because at that meeting, there were also banks who were working with farmers saying, if you plant these improved varieties, we are fairly sure that you're going to get a good yield, you're going to sell for a good price, so we're more likely to lend you money so that you can do this. And so you incentivize the whole systems towards higher productivity and yields. And I really, really like that within a community, within a locality. And then within that same community, because many farmers were still using traditional varieties of maize that were actually we went past and they were just dying. It was devastating. It was really sad to see just hundreds of acres just horrible and depressed farmers. But some farmers were encouraged to try BT cotton as an alternative so that they at least had a cash crop to buy food and to take care of their families should the maize fail. And you could see in the same locality, BT cotton doing well, hybrid rice doing well, the maize not doing well because they hadn't used drought-tolerant maize.
Right.
The point is, wherever you are, Kenya has 5 agroecological zones. You're growing a particular crop. You need certain inputs. You have certain challenges. Is it drought? Is it floods? Is it pest? You can make better choices. But how does the farmer make these choices? They generally just ask each other.
Right.
And then if one person gets it wrong, they all get it wrong.
Right.
So
then that then means that because do you think that then there is a information problem? Does there need to be more, I don't know if I can call it civil education, information, because the way you've painted that picture, using Kirinyaga as a case, is many different stakeholders coming together to help the farmer. So do you think that is the solution going forward?
It is, because farming is a complex system. So it's never just about the seeds. It's also about the markets. It's also about the inputs. So you need to all come together. And this can be done, is being done all across the country. So, you know, we're working with groups that do these farms across Busia, Bungoma, Nyanza region for different crops, and they do it all through the year to strengthen it's called on-farm communication, so that you go directly to the farmers. But you also have to do a bit of consumer education. At the moment, as we talked about, GMOs getting a very bad press. So farmers are then thinking, okay, farmers generally we want to grow what grows and makes us a profit. So they are incentivized towards using GMO drought-tolerant maize. But then they're like, but will we be able to sell it? So if there's a backlash in the markets, then there's no incentive for the farmer to use the improved varieties.
Because who will buy it?
Because who will buy it? But then everything goes down. The stocks goes down, the availability goes down, because public sentiment is negative. So we do have to not just talk to the farmer, but also talk to the consumers. And that's what we do, and that's why I'm here.
I mean, you know, as we, back then when we had, when we were talking about Vision 2030 when it was launched, it seemed like it's so far away. Now we are closing in. One of the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, coupled with that is to have a world that is free of hunger by 2030. Now we are just, I mean, time is flying fast. And you've talked about the sentiments of GMO. I remember even an interview that the president had partly aired on this station where he was saying, I've heard people saying women will grow beards and people will have 2 heads and all this stuff. Is, in your opinion, are GMOs then the solution or a solution to food security in Kenya?
They're part of a solution. And you have to use everything that you can. And so they're a critical part of our arsenal in fighting food insecurity. But you have to look at what are the other things. So GMOs are one thing, but a large part of the reason why we have food insecurity is conflict. So conflict-prone regions, conflict in Ukraine, you know, there you go. So there's that. There's also inequality. So you see here in Kenya, when we say they're 4.4 million in food insecure, they're generally in pockets in particular counties. So there's, you know, so the brunt of it is not equally spread. You actually have to put resources into particular places, hard to reach places, and so you're looking at that. You also have to look at access to markets, so the economic conditions. So there are a number of things. So the government can do something about economy, access to markets, access to inputs.
Access to credit.
Access to credit. We also have to look at climate change. We also have to look at conflict. So GMOs fit into one part of a bigger solution. So nobody's going to say, okay, use GMOs now, that's the end. Because GMOs have been around for a long time. And countries that have used it as part of a holistic solution are richer and are doing well because it's part of a holistic solution. And that's what we're supporting and promoting across the developing world, not just Africa.
So it's not just the solution. It's part of a...
Not a magic bullet.
Right.
Nothing is.
Right. All right, good. And I mean, people have, like I said, even going back to that interview again, people have, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So, it's definitely such a hot button topic. What are some of the, some of the health concerns, for example, around GMOs, because genetically modified foods? What are some that you have heard?
I'm not going to repeat it because this is the number one lesson of misinformation is don't keep repeating the misinformation.
Okay.
No, instead you counter lies with truth.
Okay, go ahead.
And so what I can say categorically is that GMOs are as safe as all other GMO foods. And GMO seeds and the technology is as safe as other technologies. And all scientific studies have shown us this. And so there is no reason to point to one particular fear, because I can have a fear that it grows, it makes me grow horn. And if there's no basis for that, there's no reason to
repeat it.
To repeat it or to counter it, because it's baseless.
Right.
But that said, fears are real, and fears are within the context of a broader fear. So the fear, I feel, is not a fear per se of the technology. It's a fear of governance. Who is governing this technology? Who is bringing this technology? And just a fear of new technology generally. Like if you look at when microwaves came, there was a fear of eating microwave foods because the radiation, what will happen? So there's a general fear of technology, and it's a stage in which we learn as human beings and navigate our world. So it's not to brush aside fears. It's to say, how do we alleviate some of those fears? And one of the things I'll say is that the technology does not come, even at research stage, without a governance framework.
Right.
Here you have a National Biosafety Agency, which before you're a scientist doing even the experiments to develop the seeds of the technology, you must have a license.
Right.
And then if you then want to move from the lab to the field, you must have another license. Then if you say, okay, I want to do it large scale or demonstration farm, you have another license. And then the results are looked at, evaluated, then the next license. By the time it's in the shops, there's a license. You have KEBS and they stamp it.
Right.
They then monitor what has happened in fact. Everywhere in the world that any food comes to the market, there are governance. So, and that is to alleviate our fears so that you don't have to know too much science to trust when you go to the supermarket. Because who really has that much time to learn about every single thing you pick off the shelf? So I'm cognizant of the fact that people are fearful, but I also want to emphasize that as a continent, we've really matured. Our scientists are developing this.
Right.
Our own regulators are doing this. Our governments are really more responsible than we give them credit for.
Right.
Because they have taken a cautious approach to this technology. They've looked and seen what happened abroad, and they've weighed up the balance, and then allowed for the crops that matter. So here it's maize. In Nigeria, that is the most successful in commercialization, it's cowpea.
Okay.
We've looked at food insecurity, how much the cowpeas are the black-eyed beans that we eat, which is a staple, and said the pest that ravaged nearly 70% due to post-harvest losses, we need to do more about that. And so the technology went all the way, and now then farmers planted, now that technology is out there, and Nigerians are really happy. Farmers are happy, consumers are happy, and the fears have gone down because the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say.
Right. So there are two categories. When you talk about fears, there are different categories. One of them is a question that people ask. Somebody has asked here on SMS. Somebody says, why are, it looks like there are some big companies forcing farmers to grow GMOs. Somebody is asking that. Is that part of the misinformation? There is that concern that this is some company somewhere forcing an agenda on people. What would you say to that?
I understand that, and that's why I'm saying generally when people are afraid of the technology, what are they afraid of? They're afraid of big foreign multinational agencies with their profit agenda. That's what they're afraid of. And that happens a lot in food industry. But what I can say that we know and are working here on the continent is that it's African scientists and national research institutes that are working here in labs developing that technology. A lot of the seeds are royalty-free, and even when there's a cost, they're subsidized. So this technology, not with BT maize, it's been developed here on the continent, is not foreign corporations.
Okay.
That's not to say that they are not foods and seeds that foreign corporations are developing. Why not? There's a spectrum. It's like with medicines. You have some that are developed by certain corporations that are global, and there's some that are indigenous and generic. And so you have a spectrum. The point is choice.
Okay.
And for us here, and I say us because I'm African, it's about empowering African scientists to use the technology to bring the solutions that Africans want, for the reasons, for the challenges we face, for the solutions we want. The more we do that, this fear of foreign corporations will go, because we'll be able to prove it.
Right.
That's why I told you about the rice. It is Kenyan rice, bred in Kenya,
From
grown
Kisumu
in Kenya,
to
Malindi, back to Kirinyaga.
Right. All right. So Cliff from Nairobi is asking a question that will lead me to another question, because I think we've talked about this already. Says, my question is, does GMO have any effects to the human body? Can it cause sickness? That then goes to my other question. In terms of, you talked about at every stage there's a regulatory process. So is there also some risk assessments done?
Of course.
Tests done?
Of course. I mean, that's what science is about.
Right.
Science is always about weighing the risk. And science generally has a precautionary process. You calibrate the baseline. You say, what happens when we have no GMOs? You look at different risk, pests. You look at how much pesticides and chemicals you have to spray, and you look at the risk to the farmer of spraying the chemical pesticides. You look at the risk to the environment. You balance that with GM technology, and you say, okay, the pests are not there, they're not spraying as much, the soil is healthier, the farmer is healthier, and the crop does not have so much chemical residue.
Right.
And then you see what happens in the human body. So those are all assessed. So every type of risk is assessed.
Okay.
And so I can assure them, as far as scientific knowledge goes in GMOs, which is over 3 decades now, it is safe, and we are not afraid of that.
Right. Yeah. Another conversation around GMO is when it comes to labeling. People feel like, it should be labeled, that this seeds GMO. What do you feel about that? Do you think that will help allay fears? Do you think it's a valid concern? Yeah.
Well, generally, I'm in favor of labeling to allow people to make choices.
Right.
But often the labeling is about stigma. Where there's a stigma to a GMO, you say this one, because there's an idea that once you say organic, it's fresh, it's natural, it's good, and whatever. But there's some organic crops that there are lots of risks assessment that haven't been done.
Right.
There are some chemical pesticides, like when you look at potato, blight. Potatoes are prone to blight.
Right.
So even organic potatoes sometimes are sprayed with copper sulfate pesticides to allow them to grow. So it's often about how markets use it to what do you call it, virtue signaling.
Right.
So there's a virtue signal. So it's for the country to decide. It's not for me to say you shouldn't label. I generally like to know the choices I'm making. Right. And generally, I do see GMO labeled foods, and I don't have a problem with it, because I know it's been tested. I know I have a less chemical residue, and I know that somebody has tested it for all kinds of things that I can now consume. So I'm generally happier with a highly regulated food than one that hasn't been gone through very rigorous testing standards.
All right, somebody's asking, which crops are genetically engineered? Is it for us, you said maize, right?
I mean...
Or different?
There are many different ingredients. A lot of the foods you're already eating in this country have GMO ingredients.
Okay.
So let's just be clear with that. You generally are not, you're not going to say, I've never eaten anything GMO.
Right.
That's highly unlikely.
Right.
You've generally eaten it in some form or another. But in terms of commercialization, here in Kenya, we're looking at BT cotton and maize. In Nigeria, cowpea. Also looking at banana research into banana wilting. So because it's a big crop in East Africa, cash crop is economically important, and it's very prone to different diseases.
Right.
So the scientists are working on GMOs to stop those diseases. Sorghum. So a lot of cassava, of course, all kinds of varieties of cassava, and enhancing the vitamins in cassava. Also, in terms of, in Nigeria, we use cassava for so many different things. So having varieties that are good for our pounded yam, our fufu. Some you want one that's stickier, some you don't want it because you use cassava chips. So the cassava also has a lot of work done for consumer taste.
Right. So it's all about taste. One of the other groups that is very concerned and about this, so we've talked about big companies, then we also have politicians coming into it as well, other public interest groups. Why do you think there's just generally that much concern even among that group now? Because yes, there's the big companies like somebody asked there, and then now there's this group. There are some politicians who you'll hear they're for or against. Even just when there was that announcement here in Kenya, there were a lot of conversations among politicians who say they are speaking for their constituents. Yes.
Politics rules everything, doesn't it? In every country in the world. And because politics looks at the science, the economics, and the social interest. So
does it always, though? Anyway.
There's a balance. Right. And some things, so sometimes in many countries, it's a trade interest. Okay. So if you have a market, if you're trying to grow an organic market, you may now come against GMOs because you want to secure boundaries around your export market of GMOs. So sometimes that's the politics. Okay. And sometimes it's just politicians also speak to public sentiment. So if your public say we don't like it and you want to get voted, you go with public sentiment. Right. So sometimes it's hard to go against the current and look at what is the risk of not using improved technologies. What are the risks to what happens when you come back and people are hungry and they come back to you for food subsidies? If you're a politician that balances the complexities, you'll say, yes, we know that these are your fears. How can we help alleviate this? Because the real danger we're facing is famine. Right. And I, as a politician, I have to make a decision which may not be very palatable at this stage, but I'm taking a longer-term view as to how do we bring food security to the country, which is what the president is doing. Right. How do we reduce importation? How do we become resilient and food secure? And the stigma of just every year the international world seeing dying children because of hunger in a country that grows food. So politicians should play the long game. That's what I'm saying. Not just for the country, but for the world. Because right now, this debate in Kenya is actually a global debate. The whole world is looking at how Kenya is dealing with this anti-GMO sentiment. And, you know, it can be a wave. And fear is infectious. Right. But then, as you're saying, the cost of that infection is the real danger of food insecurity and famines, global famines. Right. Because the war in Ukraine, we've seen the impact now, but it's not finished. Even if the war ends today, the impact on the food systems will go on for the next 10 years. So we have a real crisis, as you're seeing with inflation. Because of this, we have to find solutions now.
Right, and we're going to talk about inflation in a bit. I have another question here. Someone says, do GMO plants reduce pesticide use?
They do. That has been tested. It reduced pesticides use by about 37%. Okay. In fact, the figure is, globally, it's like 671 million tons of pesticides chemical pesticides are not used when you use GMO, have been safe. So the environment has been safe from that much pesticide pollution because you have crops that are pest resistant. So yes, and so it's not just good for the environment, it's good for the farmers. Yeah.
All right. And somebody else asks, do GMOs have an impact on allergies? That's a question.
That's an interesting question. You know, allergies are not GMOs specifically, but foods and crops have. You can be allergic to anything. So it's not that it is necessarily tied to the GMO. It is tied to the crop. So you can be allergic to peanuts, different varieties, and it's very specific. So they've not been linked specifically to triggering allergies, but foods and crops, people have allergies for all kinds of different reasons.
Right. All right. Yeah. All right. So you talked about inflation and said we'll circle back to it. In just looking at the picture that you've painted, 10 years of even if the war ends in Ukraine, and it's definitely had the inflation is on the rise. So there's a farmer who's watching and wondering, so how then do I make cheaper but cheaper produce but healthier produce as well? So what are the things that I do so that you've interacted with the farmers a lot? So what would be your advice to them?
Well, I would say get the best advice that you can, and don't just ask your neighboring farmer.
Right.
Try and ask 3 or 4 other people. Every crop has improved hybrid varieties that are actually readily available. Okay. So even if you are not interested in GMO maize, there are better varieties of maize that for your particular agroecological zone would be better, depending on where you are. Get your soil tested, and a lot of these things are free from agencies around the country who want higher productivity and higher yields. National extension workers work closely with farmers to help and also to look at what can you do in terms of alleviating some of the pressures. So we saw a farm that had some trees circling the plot, and depending on what species of tree that you plant, it affects also the water, how the water is sucked from, and then it affects what kind of crop so if you have a crop that needs a lot of water, and then you have trees that you've planted that take a lot of water out of the soil, that balance is already, so you'd have to know that. A lot of the times farmers don't really necessarily know that. And some trees enrich the soil. So knowing how to border your plot and what happens, how you control for water and all other stresses, you can learn. There are lots of, Kenya is such a wonderful country. There are lots of apps that help farmers to find out more about what's happening, how to deal with pests, fall armyworms. There are lots of communities, WhatsApp communities and groups. We're going to do more as Alliance for Science on vernacular radio. We're going to start bringing farmers to give advice to other farmers and putting the science out there using farmers' voices. So you're going to see more of that this year on all platforms, vernacular radio, farm radio, TV, newspapers. We're going to try to give bite-sized information that you need when you need it.
All right. And then also, one of the conversations, again, like you said, should center around the continent. So it's not a country-specific problem, things like climate change, etc., drought, famine, etc. So how then do we move from, we have relief, how do we move from relief and get to resilience? How do you do that?
Yes. We have to look at this as a continent looking at our food systems. So I think 2 months ago, there was a food system summit in Rwanda, and the president, all the heads of state were there looking at food systems in their country. And the president of Kenya spoke very eloquently about increasing inputs, irrigation, subsidizing fertilizer, farmers, and all of those things. So countries are looking at it and learning from each other. Leaders are learning from each other. But also, how do you get inputs from a shorter distance? So instead of flying in some of the inputs, we do have fertilizer manufacturing capacity in Africa, and yet we mostly import from Ukraine. And we found the vulnerability in so doing from going so far away. So world food systems for the last decade, because of cheap flights and the idea that you don't need to have everything in one country, you can take something from here, and you focus on your little element. Well, COVID showed us that not having your critical inputs as close to you as possible, your shorter supply chains, is where your inherent vulnerability is. So moving towards resilience is about shortening your food supply systems for critical inputs and also for markets. So as a region, now that Africa, Africa signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, now we're beginning to say, let's look at intra-African trade, trading in all kinds of things, also markets, accessing markets instead of flying, growing for food that is going to go very far away. Maybe it can go to your neighbor.
All right. So one of the other things is we talked about earlier on, like I said, climate change. And sometimes I feel like we have the conferences and we do the best we can, even as media, to kind of extrapolate what is being said there. But, again, in terms of information to the farmer, what are some of the things that they can do? What practices, what measures can we put in place to improve food security even in our country?
Yeah, I mean, we need to look at sort of cultivation methods. How are we looking at our ecosystems? Where's our water coming from, and is it sustainable? What are we putting into the water? And you may be doing something upstream in a hilly region, and you're polluting everything downstream. So the farmer downstream is suffering the effects of you not thinking about how your runoff goes down. So beginning to take a landscape approach and being responsible within the ecosystem. So don't just look at your little plot and you cut away all the trees. You may have 1 or 2 years good harvest, but then you've destroyed your ecosystem for the next 10 years because it takes a long time for those trees to grow back and the whole system to be replenished. So I think it's beginning to have a landscape approach, and we're going to also do more work around that. So getting farmers across a landscape to say, what does this landscape need to be replenished in critical resources, water, soil richness, all of those sorts of things? And what practices do you have here that are detrimental and can change? And they vary from place to place. Quite frankly, Kenya should be the climate capital of the world, quite frankly, because here we have the top agencies globally. We have UNEP, which turns out the best research around environmental protection, climate resilience. We have the IITA, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture. We have campuses, ISIPE, ILRI, you have CalRO. All of these global knowledge centers, world-class, doing excellent work that's being published in papers across the world and being celebrated, and the scientists here go, they go to America and Oxford and whatever and give presentations. But we've not shared that knowledge here so well, at least not in ways that is easily understood. That's where we come in. We are science communication. We bridge the gap between scientists and the beneficiaries, those that need to make decisions, the farmers. So we take that information, we put it in little booklets, we put it on radio, we talk to people directly to help you make a decision. Because the government has invested a lot in sending those scientists to school, abroad, in PhDs, for you as the farmer sitting somewhere to have a better life. They're supposed to serve you.
All right. And, of course, definitely is a conversation that can, you know, go on and on and on. And, you know, unfortunately, the time is not on our side. But before I let you go, there's an important day coming up, 11th of February, International Day of Women and Girls in Science.
Yes.
I want to talk about women and girls in science. That is the 11th of Feb, people. That is coming up. Just briefly, what are some of the challenges that women in science face, and then how can they overcome those challenges? Because,
okay.
you know, it's something that there are a lot of people, there are children now just who have been placed in schools and they have dreams of being scientists. There are people watching who have dreams. What are some of the challenges they face, and how can they
Okay, this is very close to my heart, of course, as you know. I come from a family of very powerful, empowered women, educators. My mother's a teacher. And she said to me from an early age, you need to be a scientist because science helps you to make better decisions about your life, but also you'll get a better job and it'll pay you more, you know, you know, than studying humanities. And I just took her advice. But also, so because once you become a scientist, you learn how to balance data, you learn how to make decisions, you learn the core things of critical thinking. And that's what science does for you. But we've been talking about the food crisis. You know, 80% of the productivity on the continent is done by women. So 80% of the farm work is done by women. So if our women and girls had even rudimentary basic scientific knowledge, it would actually improve food security. They would understand more about the soil, they would understand more about productivity, farming methods. But also they'd understand more about helping the children. Because women, when you empower a woman with knowledge, she empowers an entire household, she empowers an entire community. So it's very important that the bedrock of science and innovation, that we promote it in women and girls. Because right now we're seeing that the percentage of women who study science is still below 50%. It's probably about a third in most countries. And why? Because there's a stigma about, at a certain age, about, you know, you're a nerdy scientist, it's not cool, you won't find a husband, you know, all those sorts of things. And there's a stereotype about what a scientist should look like. In fact, I'll just say a quick thing. So when I was at, I came here a few weeks ago and I was on radio, Hot FM, on the Jeff Koinange show. And then there were a lot of tweets and a lot of them were like, she wears too much makeup to be a scientist. You know, she can't be an expert. How can she be an expert? You know, there were actually a lot of misogynistic comments around that. Sad. You know, that goes to show you those stereotypes are still there. But I really want us to encourage our women and girls to go into science, because then we'll find solutions for the world, but also for women. You find that a lot of pharmaceutical products are tested mostly on men or for men, and a lot of lines of inquiry in terms of subjects are geared towards the things that are important to men. But because they're the ones with the power and they're the ones that are heading research institutions that define the research agenda. So let's have more women and girls coming into the field to bring solutions for health, for climate, for all kinds of things.
All right. Well, I hope, you know, that conversation changes. And, you know, if you're out there and you're studying science, you love science and you're a woman, keep on doing it. Keep on, you know, celebrating, keep on doing it. So maybe before we wrap up, how can people get in touch with you? Probably there's a farmer who wants to get in touch with you.
Yes.
Or a lady wants to continue to be inspired by you and get mentored and all that. How can they get in touch with you?
Please follow us on all our social media platforms. So the Alliance for Science has our social media is @ScienceAlly. Become an ally to us. We work at all levels. We work in school projects in Naivasha, looking at biotech education in schools. We work with farmers. We work with policymakers all across Kenya specifically, but Africa and Asia and Latin America. We have fellows, people who've been trained to support. We are interested in hearing from you. We're anxious to connect with you. Become an ally.
All right. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for the conversation. I know there's still a lot of feedback because this, like you said, is a hot button topic. We covered the ones that we could, but like you said, if you have more, if you need more information, then you can follow at Science Ally. You said? Yes, be a Science Ally and get more information on this. It's a conversation that must be had, so don't shy away from it. And like you said, probably at one point or another, you have consumed some genetically modified food, so and you're still here. So have the conversation, get as much information as you can, and fight the misinformation, because surely growing two heads is movie stuff, but it's okay. All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you again tomorrow. Remember, successful people look like you. God loves you, and that will never change. Peace and love.
Amen. Thank you so much.